In 1896, the Lumiere brothers premiered their short film, Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat, 50 seconds of a train pulling into a station. Audiences of the time were, supposedly, so terrified of the train chugging towards them that they dove from their seats. That's the main reason this film is remembered, but it's more important for another reason. See, Arrival of a Train, which came 8 years after the very first motion picture, marks film's quick transition from novelty into industry because it was among the first films to require paid admission. Most art forms and technologies start out like this as gimmicks. They grow because they can make a buck. And video games, just like film, were no exception. But why are films art and video games just games? Well, that's a question of medium.
Thank you.
Let's look at Citizen Kane. It's often regarded as one of the best films of all time for its revolutionary blending of visual and audio composition with its narrative, and is widely considered the moment that film inarguably became an art form, half a century after the first film was created. Importantly, it also proved that the facets of the medium itself, moving pictures, could be considered artistic. Take Arrival of a Train, which can be broken down into a case study of two film techniques. One is the immediacy caused by an object moving quickly towards the camera and so the viewer. The other is that the object moves from top right to bottom left. The linear motion makes it seem unstoppable, and both the diagonal and right to left aspects of the motion are disconcerting to a Western audience that reads horizontally left to right. Short of putting the camera on the tracks, this was the most intimate POV depiction possible. To see this artistry inherent to the medium, the mainstream needed to see those techniques tied to narrative, something that's been considered a basis for art since the beginning of humans not killing each other all the time. And from the start, filmmakers wanted to tell stories and producers expected them. You can draw someone in with visuals, but you keep them invested with narrative. Once the medium earned artistic recognition, its own merits shone through so bright that the very first films were retroactively elevated to art status. Pong, you may notice, has not achieved this status. And Pong, believe it or not, could be argued art. Pong has two main systems. The ball's direction changes depending on where on your paddle you hit it, and the ball speeds up after a few volleys. They're facts you internalize within a few rounds of play, and it quickly builds players up to a state of what's called yomi, Japanese for reading, which in the fighting game community describes how players read each other, goad out attacks they can counter. In layman's terms, within minutes, you aren't just returning the ball, you're thinking about whether to hit it with top, center, or bottom of your paddle. Which of these rock, paper, scissors will psych your opponent out, much like a goal kick in soccer. Pong gets you from beginner to a level of comfort that allows creativity. Games start to mind games in minutes. It's elegant, it's artful, it's art. But you probably hadn't even considered that before. Why? I'd argue that it's harder to consider the artistry of something without narrative, even if that narrative is historical context. Games didn't start out narratively driven, nor has narrative been games' strongest suit. They're what I call an internalized medium, where most are externalized. Consider something like Neo taking the red pill in the Matrix, opting to know the hard truth. Your experience here is passive. You watch it and think, what would I have done? In even a linear game, you have to physically consent to the action continuing with a button press. You're allowing a choice. You're allowing a story. In a non-linear game, you make that choice, and you have to ask yourself the much tougher question, who am I? Who am I? What video games do best, then, is focus on the player's independence within a game, which makes narration harder, but its potential impact deeper. As with film, though, this focus was not initially used for art so much as amusement. They were dubbed video games after all, screen-based novelties, and the artistic depths which could be delved by this new medium took a backseat to how immediately engaging and attention-consuming it could be. The first games then caught on because they were fun. Most were pretty literal digitizations like Pong, flashy action like Doom, or potential drug metaphors like the pill-gobbling Pac-Man being chased by ghosts, or Mario's mushrooms which make him feel bigger. Hardly War and Peace, but fun to play. And while narrative became increasingly important, gameplay usually still ruled the day. Resident Evil, for instance, was a terrifying blast with a pretty nonsensical plot and, at least in the English dub, voice acting marred by directors who didn't speak the language of the people they were directing.
What do you think of it?
I've been thinking something is wrong with this house.
Right.
Hey, what is this? There's a page missing.
Yeah, I thought about that too. Perhaps that was the most important part.
Yet, there was a time when it was the best-selling PlayStation game ever. Meanwhile, King's Field came out the same year in 1996. Developed by FromSoft, who are now known for Dark Souls, its dark atmosphere and environmental storytelling created a foreboding mood. But to many, King's Field was so muddy and slow that its narrative was ruined by immersion-breaking gameplay. King's Field is largely forgotten now. What's important to note here, however, is that Resident Evil imparted its world through mechanics. With deliberate movement, low resources, and powerful enemies, you constantly felt overwhelmed, even though you played as a trained soldier. The mechanics communicated this to you better than the story could. This split between narrative and mechanical communication often presents two problems in games. One is that narrative is treated as a reward for gameplay more than its driving force. For beating a level, you are rewarded with the cutscene. The other problem is how often gameplay is at odds with narrative. No, you don't! One designer who deals beautifully with what many call ludonarrative dissonance is Jonathan Blow. His breakout hit Braid used the gameplay's time and space manipulation as an allegory for the protagonist's racking of his own memory to try to recapture something he'd lost, using new strategies and perspectives to get closer and closer to a truth constantly out of reach. And The Witness is about witnessing. And more. You're going to have to trust me on that one. The problem with trying to learn from Blow's emphasis on mechanics is that they don't necessarily play well to a more detailed narrative, one which requires specifics and specific actions. Does that mean games aren't the ideal form for these stories? Not necessarily. It just means different narratives have different rules for how to best tell their story through, or alongside, gameplay. Blow's kind of gameplay is constantly rooted to an idea, concept, or meaning that can't be expressed directly in words, which is what makes his game so powerful. To tell a more straightforward story, however, requires a different strategy. Use gameplay to root the player as an entity in the world of the story you are telling. One of the deceptively simplest examples of this comes from Nier Automata, where you play as an android that is fighting for humans, against robots that are fighting for aliens. Your protagonist is constantly admonishing other androids for exhibiting emotion.
I don't usually get a partner. It's kind of fun.
Emotions are prohibited.
And she clearly experiences it, but hides it. She's a ruthless, efficient killing machine who is rebuilt after every death. How can the game humanize her? Make her trip? Even a killing machine, when trying to sprint straight through a bush or over a rock, will stumble. She recovers clumsily, not gracefully, and it takes her a few seconds to right herself and carry on like that didn't just happen. The player feels stupid, she looks stupid, and in that moment, she's alive. She's just a clumsy girl thrown into a war, destined to die endlessly. Gameplay, then, can communicate character, setting, and theme, but rarely can it communicate all at once. And that's why video games, the internalized medium, are so difficult to judge and relate. They're experiential, a synthesis of developer curation and player autonomy. And the best are often inaccessibly difficult for non-gamers, whereas it doesn't take a film student to enjoy Citizen Kane. Games are art, but you can see why it's so hard to put into words something that wasn't made for words. But when you're in there, when the stakes are high, and it's time for you to act, when you're in there, it gets in you too.